The Weight of Salt Air. Chapter 1. Morning Rituals. The kettle's whistle cut through the dawn's silence like a seabird's cry, and Henry Ashworth turned from his kitchen window where he'd been watching the fog lift from Gull's Bay. Steam rose from his cup in delicate spirals, a daily communion with solitude that had become sacred these past 3 years since Margaret's passing. Through the lace curtains, Margaret's choice, kept now as much from inertia as sentiment. He could see the yellow cottage next door stirring to life. A light flickered on in what he knew to be the studio, and his chest tightened with that familiar mixture of anticipation and resignation. Elena would be starting her morning ritual too, greeting canvas and color while he greeted silence and memory. 67 years old, he thought, and still waiting for the school bell like a nervous boy. The absurdity wasn't lost on him. Henry had spent 43 years as head librarian at Millbrook Elementary, shepherding children through their first tentative relationships with books, watching them grow and leave and return with children of their own. He understood the geography of young hearts, could map their territories of hope and heartbreak with the precision of a cartographer. But his own heart, it seemed, had learned nothing from all those years of observation. He sipped his tea, Earl Grey, no sugar, a habit refined through decades, and allowed himself the dangerous pleasure of remembering yesterday's conversation over the garden fence. Elena had been deadheading her roses, her silver-streaked auburn hair catching the late afternoon light like copper wire, her painter's fingers gentle with the thorns. "Henry," she'd called out, "you simply must see what I've done with the Sunset series. I think I've finally captured that moment when the light turns the water to mercury." He'd climbed the 3 steps to his back porch, ostensibly to water the herbs Margaret had planted, but which he maintained now with the devotion of a monk tending relics. From that vantage point, he could see into Elena's studio, could glimpse the canvases that lined the walls like windows into other worlds. "I'd be honored," he'd replied, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him still, after 2 years of such exchanges. She'd smiled then, that radiant, unconscious smile she gave to everyone from the mailman to Father Morrison to the teenage boy who helped her carry groceries. A smile democratic in its warmth, offering friendship to all who encountered it, requiring nothing more than basic human kindness in return. It was a smile that had never once, in all their conversations about art and books and the peculiar way the fog rolled in on Tuesday mornings, suggested that she saw him as anything more than Margaret's widowed husband, a gentle man of letters who could recommend a good biography or help her understand the more obscure references in the contemporary novels she devoured between paintings. Henry set down his teacup and opened the morning paper, though the ritual felt increasingly hollow. The world beyond Gull's Bay, with its wars and scandals and technological marvels, seemed as distant as the moon. His universe had contracted to these few blocks of weathered shingle houses, the harbor where fishing boats bobbed like corks, and the gravitational pull of the yellow cottage next door. The front page carried news of a celebrity divorce, something about cryptocurrency, and a small item about a library closing in Portland due to budget cuts. He read the last with the particular pain of a man watching his profession die by degrees. Libraries, those sacred spaces where silence held meaning and knowledge waited patiently on shelves, were becoming as obsolete as the card catalogs he'd once maintained with such meticulous care. Change, he thought. Everything changes except the human heart, which goes on wanting what it cannot have with the persistence of tide against stone. Through the window, he watched Elena emerge from her studio, coffee mug in hand, to survey her garden. She wore a blue flannel shirt over paint-stained jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose bun secured with what appeared to be a paintbrush. At 50, she possessed that particular vitality of women who had found their calling, a brightness that seemed to emanate from some internal source, independent of external validation. Henry knew her story in broad strokes, assembled from 2 years of careful listening. a late-blooming artist who'd spent her 20s and 30s raising 2 children, now grown and scattered to Boston and Seattle. A divorce 10 years ago from a man who'd never understood why she needed to paint, who'd seen her art as a hobby rather than a necessity. Her move to Gull's Bay 3 years ago, seeking the kind of light and solitude that called to painters like sirens called to sailors. She bent to examine her tomato plants, and Henry found himself memorizing the curve of her shoulders, the way she tucked a wayward strand of hair behind her ear. These small gestures had become precious to him, collected and stored like pressed flowers in the book of memory. The telephone's ring startled him from his reverie. He glanced at the clock, 8:30, too early for most social calls, and lifted the receiver with the wariness of a man whose quiet mornings were sacred. "Dad," Sarah's voice carried the particular tension that preceded difficult conversations. Henry settled into his kitchen chair, preparing for whatever maternal crisis or professional triumph his daughter needed to share. "Hello, sweetheart. How are things in Boston? That's what I'm calling about." A pause, filled with the weight of unspoken complications. "David's been offered a position in London. 2 years, maybe 3. It's a wonderful opportunity, but it meant the grandchildren would be an ocean away instead of a 4-hour drive." Henry felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the sense of the world contracting even further, leaving him more isolated in his small coastal orbit. "That's wonderful news," he said, because it was what a good father said. "London's a magnificent city. The children will love it. Dad, I know what you're thinking. We wouldn't go if you needed us here. If you were lonely or..." "Sarah," his voice carried the gentle authority he'd once used to quiet chattering children during story hour. "I'm fine. More than fine. I have the house, the garden, good neighbors. You mustn't make decisions based on an old man's social calendar." It wasn't entirely a lie. He did have these things, but they were stage props in a play he performed for one, a careful arrangement of activities and interests designed to convince others, and sometimes himself, that his life retained purpose and meaning. After he'd convinced Sarah of his independence and blessed their upcoming adventure, Henry hung up the phone and returned to his window. Elena had finished her garden inspection and was walking toward his fence, coffee mug still in hand. "Henry," she called, "I hope I'm not interrupting your breakfast." He stepped onto his porch, grateful for any interruption to his morning's brooding. "Not at all. How are the roses recovering?" "Magnificently. I think your advice about the bone meal made all the difference." She smiled up at him, and he noticed a small smudge of yellow paint on her right cheek. "I was wondering, and please feel free to say no, but I'm having a few people over Saturday evening. Nothing fancy, just wine and cheese and a chance for folks to see the new paintings. Would you consider joining us?" Henry's heart performed a small acrobatic routine against his ribs. A gathering in Elena's studio, surrounded by her art and her friends, standing close enough to hear her laugh and watch her hands gesture as she talked about color and light and the ineffable business of capturing life on canvas. "I'd be delighted," he said, then worried the response sounded too eager. "What can I bring?" "Just yourself. And maybe that wonderful cheese selection from Hartley's Market. You always know exactly what to choose." After she'd returned to her studio, Henry remained on his porch, watching the fog complete its morning retreat. The invitation felt like a gift, dangerous in its generosity. For a few hours on Saturday evening, he would exist in Elena's orbit not as the quiet neighbor who helped with heavy boxes and recommended books, but as a guest, a person whose presence she had specifically requested. He knew the evening would be bittersweet, watching her charm everyone in the room while he stood carefully at the margins, nursing a single glass of wine and finding small ways to be useful. But even the pain of loving someone who could never love him back had become precious, a reminder that his heart still functioned, still insisted on feeling despite reason's arguments for resignation. Margaret, he thought, would have understood. His late wife had been a woman of fierce intuitions, capable of reading the complicated calculus of human hearts with the skill of a master accountant. She would have seen through his careful pretense of neighborly interest within moments. But she also would have understood that love, at 67, was different than love at 27, less demanding of reciprocation, more grateful for simple proximity to beauty and vitality. The morning stretched ahead of him, empty and full of small possibilities. He would walk to the harbor and buy fresh fish for dinner. He would tend Margaret's herb garden and read another chapter of the biography of Virginia Woolf he'd been savoring like expensive wine. He would plan what to wear to Elena's gathering, selecting clothes that suggested casual confidence rather than the careful desperation of an aging man trying too hard to seem young. And if he was lucky, Elena might step onto her porch while he worked in the garden, and they would exchange a few words about the weather or the progress of her latest painting. These fragments of conversation would sustain him through another day of solitude, proof that he still existed in the world beyond his own careful thoughts. The fog had lifted completely now, revealing the bay in all its morning glory. Fishing boats dotted the horizon like punctuation marks in a sentence he was still learning to read. Henry finished his tea, folded his newspaper, and prepared to begin another day in the subtle choreography of unrequited love. Chapter 2: The Architecture of Longing. Thursday afternoons had become Henry's favorite time for grocery shopping. The market was quiet then, staffed by familiar faces who had time for conversation, and there was always the possibility, carefully unacknowledged but persistently present, that he might encounter Elena among the produce or in the narrow aisle where they stocked imported cheeses. Today, his timing proved fortuitous. He found her in the wine section, studying a bottle of Pinot Grigio with the same intensity she might bring to analyzing the composition of a challenging landscape. "The Italian whites are particularly good this season," he offered, approaching with the casual air of a man whose presence was entirely coincidental. Elena turned, her face brightening with genuine pleasure. "Henry, perfect timing. I'm trying to choose wine for Saturday, and I'm hopeless at it. Robert always handled these decisions, and I never paid attention." The mention of her ex-husband created a small ripple in Henry's composure, a reminder of the long history he hadn't shared, the intimate domestic knowledge he would never possess. But he pushed past the jealousy, such an unbecoming emotion in a man his age, and focused on the pleasant task of being helpful. "What's your menu like?" he asked, studying the wine selection with the seriousness of a scholar contemplating manuscript variations. "Oh, you know me. Nothing complicated. Those little tartlets from Romano's bakery, some good cheese, maybe that fig and prosciutto thing from the deli. I want people to focus on the paintings, not worry about spilling something on their clothes." Henry nodded, understanding more than she intended. Elena's entertaining style reflected her painting, generous, unfussy, confident in its own vision without needing to impress through complexity. He selected a crisp Sancerre and a light Beaujolais, wines that would complement food without overwhelming conversation. "Perfect," Elena said, accepting his choices with the trust she might show a sommelier at an expensive restaurant. "I don't know what I'd do without your guidance." Margaret was so lucky to have someone who knew about all these things. The comment, clearly meant as a compliment, landed with unexpected weight. Henry had spent 2 years carefully constructing a version of himself that existed independently of his 40-year marriage, a man with interests and knowledge that weren't simply echoes of shared experiences. To be reduced again to Margaret's husband who knew about wine felt like a small death. Actually, he found himself saying, the wine knowledge is more recent. Since Margaret passed, I've had time to learn about things that were always on my list. French literature, classical music, wine, all the pursuits I told myself I'd explore when I retired. Elena's expression shifted, becoming softer and more focused. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to suggest. Of course you're your own person. I suppose I think of knowledge as something couples share, but that's my own bias showing." They walked toward the checkout together, and Henry found himself unexpectedly moved by her apology. It suggested a capacity for reflection, for seeing beyond the surface assumptions that governed most casual relationships. "No offense taken," he assured her, "but it raises an interesting question about identity after loss. How much of who we were was singular, and how much was partnership?" "God, yes." Elena loaded her groceries onto the conveyor belt with quick, efficient movements. "After the divorce, I spent months discovering that I actually hated Italian food, something I'd convinced myself I loved because Robert was passionate about it. Amazing how we shape ourselves around other people's preferences without even noticing." Henry watched her hands as she spoke, paint-stained fingers moving with a dancer's unconscious grace, silver rings catching the fluorescent light. Everything about Elena suggested movement, change, the vital energy of someone still becoming rather than simply being. "The opposite can be true too," he offered. "Sometimes we discover that preferences we thought were our own were actually borrowed. Margaret was the reader in our house, or so I told myself. Turns out I was just intimidated by her graduate degree in literature. Now I find myself reading novels I would never have touched when she was alive." "What are you reading now?" "A biography of Virginia Woolf. Hermione Lee's work. It's extraordinary." Elena's face lit up with the particular enthusiasm she reserved for subjects that intersected with art. "Oh, I love Woolf. The way she writes about light and color, especially Into the Lighthouse. It's like reading a painter's notebook sometimes." Henry felt a small electric shock of connection. In 40 years of marriage, Margaret had never shared his growing fascination with modernist literature. She preferred the Victorian novels of her graduate studies, finding Woolf and Joyce unnecessarily experimental. To discover this affinity with Elena felt like stumbling upon a hidden door in a familiar house. "You should borrow my copy when I'm finished," he heard himself saying. Lee's insights into the relationship between Woolf's mental state and her creative process are remarkable. "I'd love that." Elena paid for her groceries and waited while Henry completed his transaction. "Are you walking home? We could continue this conversation." The 10-minute walk to their neighborhood stretched into 20 as they detoured through the harbor area, their conversation meandering like the path itself. Elena talked about the challenge of painting water, how it was never really blue or green, but some composite of reflected light and sky. Henry found himself describing the peculiar satisfaction of cataloging books, the way each volume found its proper place in the greater architecture of knowledge. "You miss it," Elena observed as they passed the shuttered bait shop that had been sold to developers from Portland. "The library work. More than I expected." Henry paused to watch a gull dive for fish, considering how much to reveal. "I thought retirement would feel like freedom, but sometimes it feels more like irrelevance. All those years of believing my work mattered, and now children learn everything from computers. Your work did matter. Still does." Elena's voice carried surprising conviction. "I see you sometimes at the harbor, talking to the fishing crews about their books or the weather. They light up when they see you coming. That's not irrelevance. That's being valued." Henry felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, the recognition that comes from being truly seen. He had noticed his conversations with the fishermen, but had dismissed them as idle social interaction rather than meaningful connection. "I suppose," he said carefully, "we all need to feel useful." "Exactly. That's why I paint, ultimately. Not for gallery shows or sales, though those are nice, but because there are moments of light and color that deserve to be preserved, and I happen to have the skills to preserve them." They had reached the corner where their paths would diverge toward their respective houses. Elena shifted her grocery bags and smiled up at him with what he was beginning to recognize as her particular way of ending conversations. Warm but definitive, like a graceful curtain fall. "Thank you for the wine consultation," she said, "and for the company. I'm really looking forward to Saturday." "As am I." Henry watched her walk up her front path, noting the way she paused to deadhead a few roses before disappearing inside. Only then did he realize he'd been holding his breath, storing the memory of their extended conversation like a miser hoarding coins. Inside his own house, he unpacked his groceries with unusual attention to detail, arranging items in his refrigerator and pantry with the care of a curator organizing an exhibition. The mundane business of domestic maintenance felt charged with possibility, as if Elena's presence in his afternoon had infected even these simple tasks with meaning. He made himself a cup of tea and sat at his kitchen table, Virginia Woolf's biography open before him. But instead of reading, he found himself analyzing the past hour like a scholar examining a primary source document. Elena's laugh when he'd made a mild joke about the pretensions of wine descriptions, her genuine interest in his thoughts about Woolf, the moment when she'd called his work valuable, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the importance of creative pursuit. Dangerous territory, he thought, reading meaning into kindness. But even as his rational mind issued warnings, Henry felt a small flame of hope kindle in his chest. Not hope for romance. He was too experienced in disappointment for such optimistic fantasies. But hope for connection, for the possibility that his remaining years might include more than the careful management of solitude. He opened the Woolf biography and tried to focus on Hermione Lee's elegant prose. But his attention kept drifting to Saturday evening, to the prospect of standing in Elena's studio surrounded by her paintings, watching her share her work with friends who would see it with fresh eyes. The afternoon light slanted through his kitchen window, catching the dust motes that danced in the air like microscopic planets in orbit around their small, domestic sun. Henry read about Virginia Woolf's struggles with creativity and mental illness, but part of his mind was already planning what to wear on Saturday, what books he might recommend if conversation turned to literature, how to position himself in Elena's studio to best appreciate both the art and the artist who created it. 67 years old, he thought again, and still capable of anticipation. The recognition felt like a small miracle. Chapter 3, Saturday Evening Light. Henry changed clothes 3 times before settling on dark slacks, a white Oxford shirt, and the navy cardigan Margaret had given him for their last Christmas together. The sweater still held faint traces of her lavender sachets, a ghostly presence that felt more comforting than melancholy tonight. She would have wanted him to look presentable, to represent their shared taste for understated elegance. At precisely 7 o'clock, early enough to be helpful, late enough to avoid seeming overeager, he knocked on Elena's front door, the cheese selection from Hartley's Market arranged in a basket lined with one of his better tea towels. Elena answered wearing a black dress that suggested careful thought without obvious vanity, her hair loosely pinned with silver clips that caught the lamplight. She'd traded her usual paint-stained fingernails for clear polish, a small concession to formality that made Henry's breath catch unexpectedly. "Henry, perfect timing. Come in, come in." Her living room had been transformed for the evening. Furniture moved to create better flow between the main space and the studio beyond. Henry counted perhaps a dozen guests already assembled, a mixture of ages and types that spoke to Elena's gift for collecting interesting people. "Everyone," Elena called out. "I'd like you to meet Henry Ashworth, my neighbor and the person responsible for keeping me supplied with excellent book recommendations and garden advice." Henry accepted introductions with the social ease developed through decades of faculty meetings and parent conferences. There was Janet, the potter from Millbrook who fired her work in a kiln behind her house. Marcus, a retired professor of art history who'd moved here from Chicago to write his memoirs. Carol and David, seasonal residents who spent summers painting watercolors of fishing boats and old houses. But it was Elena's art that commanded attention. The studio walls displayed perhaps 20 new pieces, landscapes that captured the specific quality of coastal light with extraordinary precision. Henry found himself drawn to a particular painting of the harbor at dawn, the water rendered in layers of gray and silver that seemed to move even under artificial light. "That's my favorite of the new work," said a voice beside him. Henry turned to find Marcus, the retired professor, studying the painting with professional interest. "The technique is remarkable," Henry replied. "She's managed to suggest motion without losing the essential stillness of early morning." "You have a good eye? Are you in the arts yourself?" "A former librarian. But I've always been drawn to visual art, particularly landscapes." Henry paused, then added with careful understatement, "Elena's work has deepened my appreciation considerably." Marcus nodded knowingly. "She's the real thing. I've seen hundreds of painters attempt this particular subject. Coastal light is notoriously difficult to capture. Most artists either sentimentalize it or render it so accurately it becomes merely documentary. Elena finds the emotional truth within the visual truth." Henry absorbed this professional assessment with gratitude. His own admiration for Elena's work was so tangled with personal feeling that he sometimes wondered whether his judgment could be trusted. To have it validated by an expert felt like a small liberation. "Henry." Elena appeared beside them, wine glass in hand, cheeks flushed with the particular animation of a successful hostess. "What do you think of the Harbor series? I finally figured out how to handle those reflections that were giving me trouble. They're extraordinary," he said, and meant it with an intensity that had nothing to do with his feelings for the artist. "The way you've captured that moment when the light is neither night nor day. It's like looking at time itself suspended." Elena's face brightened with the unguarded pleasure artists show when their work is truly understood. "Exactly. That liminal moment when anything seems possible. I've been trying to paint it for months." The evening developed its own rhythm as guests moved between the studio and living room, wine glasses refilled, conversations shifting and reforming like patterns in a kaleidoscope. Henry found himself more socially confident than he'd been in years, buoyed by the quality of both art and company. He discussed Proust with Carol, who was reading Swan's Way for the third time. He advised Janet about glazes, drawing on knowledge accumulated from Margaret's brief pottery phase 15 years earlier. He listened to Marcus's theories about the decline of landscape painting in contemporary galleries, offering insights drawn from his librarian's understanding of cultural trends. But always, his attention returned to Elena. She moved through the room with the unconscious grace of someone completely comfortable in her own space, equally at ease discussing technical aspects of her work or inquiring about her guests' own projects and interests. Henry watched her explain the challenge of painting fog to David, demonstrate brushstroke techniques to Carol, listen with genuine interest to Janet's description of firing temperatures and clay chemistry. This is who she is, he thought. Not the charming neighbor who asks about books and deadhead's roses, but this, a serious artist comfortable with her own accomplishment, capable of creating beauty and sharing it generously. The recognition was both painful and liberating. His quiet domestic fantasy of Elena had been pleasant but limited, based more on projection than observation. This larger version, confident, articulate, surrounded by work that demanded respect, was simultaneously more intimidating and more worthy of his admiration. As the evening progressed, guests began to drift toward departure. Henry helped clear wine glasses and cheese plates, moving through Elena's kitchen with the careful efficiency of someone trying to be useful without overstepping boundaries. When the last guest had gone, he found Elena in her studio, standing before the harbor painting that had first caught his attention. "Successful evening," he said, joining her in contemplation of the work. "Very, though I always feel a bit drained afterward. All that talking about process and intention. Sometimes I think the paintings should speak for themselves." "They do. But people want to understand the mind behind the work. It's natural curiosity." Elena turned to study him with the same focused attention she might bring to analyzing a challenging composition. "You were wonderful tonight. I watched you talking with Marcus about art theory. and with Carol about literature. You made everyone feel smarter than when they arrived. Henry felt heat rise in his cheeks, unaccustomed to such direct praise. I enjoyed the conversation. It's been some time since I've been around people who take ideas seriously. Is that what you miss most? About teaching, I mean. The question caught him off guard with its perceptiveness. He'd been asked many times what he missed about work and had given various answers about structure and purpose and feeling needed. But Elena had identified something deeper. Yes, he said slowly. The sense that knowledge matters, that understanding literature or history or art makes us more than we were before. Children often resist that idea initially, but when they finally grasp it. He paused, remembering small faces lighting up with comprehension. There's nothing quite like that moment of recognition. You still have that effect on people. Tonight, for instance, Marcus was positively energized by your questions about contemporary landscape traditions. Henry allowed himself to feel pleasure at the observation, then wondered if Elena was simply being kind. But her expression suggested genuine assessment rather than social politeness. "Thank you," he said, "and thank you for including me tonight. Your work deserves this kind of attention." Elena moved closer to the harbor painting, studying it as if seeing it for the first time. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about capturing time suspended. I wonder if that's what all art attempts, ultimately, to hold moments that would otherwise disappear. Like Virginia Woolf's Moments of Being," Henry suggested. "Those instances when ordinary experience suddenly reveals deeper truth." Exactly. Elena's voice carried the excitement of someone making unexpected connections. Though for painters, it's visual rather than psychological. That particular quality of light that only exists for 20 minutes on Tuesday mornings, or the way shadows fall across water during a specific season. Henry felt the conversation settling into something more intimate than social exchange, the kind of intellectual partnership that had been absent from his life since Margaret's illness consumed her capacity for such discussions. "I should let you rest," he said, recognizing the evening's natural conclusion. "But I want you to know, tonight was a gift. Seeing your work properly displayed, watching you share it with appreciation it deserves. It reminded me why art matters." Elena walked him to the front door, their pace deliberately slow. "I hope we can continue the Wolf conversation soon. I'm curious about your thoughts on her relationship with painting. She wrote so beautifully about visual art." "I'll finish the biography this week and bring it over," Henry promised. "And perhaps you could recommend something about contemporary landscape painting?" Marcus mentioned some interesting names. "Absolutely." Elena opened the door to reveal the night air, soft with the scent of roses and salt. "Good night, Henry. Thank you for everything. The cheese selection was perfect, and your presence made the evening special." Henry walked the 20 yards to his own front door in a state of carefully controlled elation. The evening had exceeded his modest expectations in every way. He'd been useful, appreciated, intellectually stimulated. He'd seen Elena in her element, surrounded by work that testified to years of serious dedication. And most unexpectedly, he'd glimpsed the possibility of genuine friendship, not the careful neighborly exchanges they'd shared, but real intellectual companionship. Inside his house, he hung up his cardigan and put away the returned basket, moving through these domestic rituals with unusual awareness. The familiar spaces seemed changed somehow, charged with potential rather than simply comfortable. He made himself a cup of tea and sat at his kitchen table, but instead of feeling the evening's let down, he found himself planning. He would finish the Woolf biography by Wednesday and take careful notes about her relationship with visual art. He would research contemporary landscape painters and perhaps order a book or two from the used book dealer in Portland. He would find small ways to be helpful. Perhaps Elena needed assistance with heavy stretcher frames or advice about proper lighting for photographing paintings. Careful, he warned himself. Don't mistake opportunity for invitation. But even as his rational mind counseled restraint, Henry felt something long dormant stirring in his chest. Not the desperate longing that had characterized his attraction to Elena, but something more sustainable, the prospect of meaningful connection with another person who valued ideas and beauty. The kitchen clock chimed 11, later than he'd stayed up in months. Through his window, he could see Elena's studio lights still glowing, probably cleaning up the last traces of the evening's gathering. Tomorrow she would return to her easel, beginning another attempt to capture light and time and the ineffable business of being alive in a particular place at a particular moment. And tomorrow he would begin the day with the knowledge that solitude, while still his dominant condition, was no longer his only possibility. Chapter 4. The Weight of Tuesdays. 3 weeks after Elena's gathering, Henry established a new routine. Tuesday mornings, he would walk to the harbor to buy fish for dinner, timing his return to coincide with Elena's mid-morning break from painting. Their conversations had evolved beyond casual neighborly exchange into something resembling genuine friendship, built around shared books and Henry's growing understanding of Elena's artistic process. This particular Tuesday carried the weight of unspoken possibility. Elena had mentioned, almost in passing, that she was struggling with a commission, a landscape of the lighthouse at Cedar Point that captured both its historical significance and contemporary beauty. The client wanted something that would work in a modern office setting while honoring the site's maritime heritage. "It's proving more challenging than I anticipated," she'd confided the previous week. "I can paint the lighthouse easily enough, but finding the right context, the proper mood, that's the difficult part." Henry had listened with the careful attention he'd once brought to helping students navigate research challenges. Elena's frustration reminded him of his own struggles with finding exactly the right book for a particular child. That moment when reader and text needed to align perfectly for learning to occur. Now, walking back from the harbor with fresh haddock wrapped in paper, he considered whether to make a suggestion that had been forming in his mind. The Cedar Point Lighthouse held special significance in local maritime history, but most people knew only its current incarnation as a restored tourist attraction. Henry's years of cataloging local history materials had made him familiar with its more complex past. He found Elena in her garden, coffee cup in one hand, studying the quality of morning light with the absorbed attention she brought to all visual phenomena. She wore paint-stained jeans and an oversized blue shirt that had seen better decades, her hair loosely braided and already escaping its confines. "Morning," she called out when she spotted him. "How was the fish selection today?" "Excellent." Morrison's boat came in with fresh haddock. Henry paused at their shared fence, noting the way sunlight caught the auburn threads in Elena's hair. "How's the lighthouse commission progressing?" Elena's expression shifted to mild frustration. "Slowly. I've done 6 different sketches, and none of them feel right. The client wants something that acknowledges the lighthouse's history, but every approach I try feels either too nostalgic or too contemporary." Henry set down his fish and leaned against the fence post, considering his words carefully. "Have you researched the site's complete history? Beyond the standard tourist information, I mean." "Some." Built in 1847, automated in 1963, restored in the 1980s. The usual narrative of maritime heritage and community preservation. Elena tilted her head, recognizing something in Henry's tone. "Why? Do you know something I don't?" "Possibly. There are some interesting details in the maritime archives at the Historical Society. Letters from lighthouse keepers, shipping records, even a few photographs from the 1920s. The lighthouse has a more complicated story than most people realize." Elena's face brightened with the particular interest she showed when encountering new information that might inform her work. "What kind of complications?" Henry found himself in the pleasant position of having specialized knowledge to share. "Well, for one thing, it was nearly demolished twice. Once in 1954 when the Coast Guard wanted to build a more modern facility, and again in 1978 when developers proposed a condominium complex for the site. Both times, local activism saved it, but not without considerable political drama. That's fascinating. It suggests the lighthouse means something different to the community than just maritime nostalgia. Exactly. It's also worth noting that three different lighthouse keepers lived there with their families between 1847 and 1963. There are letters from the 1890s describing daily life, the isolation, the responsibility, the peculiar way the light affected their sleep patterns. One keeper's wife kept detailed weather records that are now used by climatologists studying historical storm patterns. Elena set down her coffee cup and gave Henry her complete attention. You think I'm approaching it too simply, as a monument rather than a place where people actually lived and worked. I think you're trying to balance historical significance with contemporary relevance, which is admirable. But perhaps the human stories, the individual experiences of the people who maintain the light, might provide a way to bridge those concerns. Henry watched Elena process this suggestion, her painter's mind already working through visual possibilities. He'd learned to recognize her creative, thinking face, a particular quality of absorbed concentration that made her seem to disappear into herself. Would you? She began, then paused. This is probably presumptuous, but would you consider showing me those archives? I'd love to see the letters and photographs you mentioned. Henry felt his heartbeat accelerate slightly. I'd be happy to. The Historical Society is only open Thursday afternoons, but I know Margaret Clemens who runs the archives. She'd probably let us browse the lighthouse materials by appointment. That would be wonderful. I could pay you for your time, of course. Research consultation or something like that. Absolutely not. Henry's response came out more firmly than intended. This is simply one neighbor helping another. Besides, I'll enjoy revisiting those materials myself. Elena's smile carried warmth and something that looked like relief. Thank you. I realize I've been thinking about this commission as a painting problem when it might really be a storytelling problem. The client wants the lighthouse's history, but maybe what they actually want is its humanity. That's beautifully put. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both contemplating the implications of this collaboration. Henry found himself aware of multiple layers of satisfaction. The pleasure of being useful, the prospect of spending extended time with Elena, the opportunity to revisit historical materials he'd always found fascinating. Thursday afternoon, then? Elena asked. Say 2 o'clock? Perfect. I'll call Margaret this morning.